Welcome to the latest episode of the Auto Futurecast with me, Chris Kirby, in association with Tomorrow's Journey and Asset Finance Connect. Today, we're joined by Euan McTurk, the battery electric consultant for Plug Life Consulting and also co-founder of ChargeSaint. We're going to talk about both today, Euan, but thanks for joining us and thanks for making the trip down from sunny Scotland to rainy London. It was rainy Scotland as well when you left, but pretty grim weather today. Just going to cover a few bits. I think today we're going to talk a lot about batteries. When we first met, we were at a conference about a year or so ago, and I heard you be interviewed on the specifically on the battery topic, and I was fascinated by some of the detail. As an electric vehicle driver, as all of our listeners will well know by now, but actually understanding a bit of the detail of how things are operating and how things are working in that world really helps you to figure out why does this car work in this way, or why does this one have less range than that one? And it's a really fascinating topic. So I really want to dive into some of that, but also the stuff around ChargeSaint. It is also super interesting, and definitely saw a good use case for it at the weekend at some new chargers near me. So anyway, we'll get to that. Just in terms of the battery technology, could you give us a bit of a general overview of like kind of where we are today? If we're talking about in the world of cars, I guess a transition from the Nissan Leaf of a few years ago into sort of more modern. Where are we with that technology?
Well, we have seen a massive leap and bound of battery tech within the last couple of decades, as you've rightly alluded to. So lithium ion is still king within the automotive sector and looks set to be for some time. But lithium ion is an incredibly broad church of chemistries. And we're starting to see a diversification in those chemistries. So if you look at the early 2010s, there was a little bit of diversification early on, but then there was a consolidation. So when the Nissan Leaf came out, for example, they were playing about with kind of multi-cathode chemistries. There would be multiple compounds kind of mixed in together. You would always have a graphite carbon anode, negative electrode, but the positive electrode could be, for example, NMC, which is lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt oxide. In Nissan's case, they tried mixing in some cobalt-free versions of that, effectively variants on a theme. It didn't work out terribly well, so they then switched to NMC. Some startups in the US, like Coda, if I remember correctly, top marks to anyone who actually remembers Coda, they were terribly short-lived, unfortunately, but they had a lithium iron phosphate battery, which is cobalt-free, is nickel-free, is basically rust and fertilizer, and a bit of slug control pellets in there as well. Ferric phosphate tablets are genuinely slug control pellets. But the energy density of that, the range per charge you could get out of a physical weight or volume of that was nowhere near as much as cobalt-containing chemistries. So with the exception of some urban vehicles in China and electric buses that have loads of room for batteries, you saw LFP fall by the wayside. And there was a consolidation around variants of NMC, where you were gradually reducing the amount of cobalt because of ethical and price concerns, and generally increasing the amount of nickel. We're now trying to increase the amount of manganese and reduce nickel a bit. But as I say, that diversification started again in the kind of great diversification in the early kind of 2020s, when Tesla introduced a lithium iron phosphate version of the Model 3. Now, any other automotive OEM would have laughed you out of the room if you said, we're going to get a 200 plus mile range electric car that can rapid charge very quickly, that it's got great performance all year round and so on, and it's going to be cobalt-free lithium iron phosphate. But Tesla did it, and very quickly, a lot of other Western OEMs started to try and copy that. But China cut its teeth on lithium iron phosphate. As an industry, lithium iron phosphate is a bit more of a forgiving chemistry to get right. So China became brilliant at mass producing LFP, and that's why so many Chinese OEMs like BYD, for example, and the MG EVs, the standard range MG EVs that you see today, use lithium iron phosphate. And we're starting to see Western OEMs starting to adopt that chemistry too. But that is just the beginning of that diversification, because as we'll discuss in a minute, there are other elements to that broad church of lithium ion, and there are some that look beyond lithium ion, which are currently under development and even in real world trials. Yeah,
interesting. So it's definitely a journey, and that was one of the things that definitely struck me about the battery chemistry part. I hadn't really considered that. You just go, it's a lithium ion battery. That's the same as is in my electric drill. Everyone just assumes it's the same thing, but actually understanding just some of the nuances. And I guess the challenge for the manufacturers themselves is that they're battling the battery density, I guess, and weight. So there's a thing of, the more weight, I guess it makes it less efficient. And then also the charge speeds. Are those the kind of two, not variables, I guess, but variable outputs that you get? Is that what you're trying to balance with some of the chemistry?
Yeah. If you look at a battery as a black box, and without delving into the electrochemistry and chemistry and thermal management and so on that adds to those kind of factors, it is, as you said, it's weight and charging speed, or C rate technically. C rate is the power in or out of the battery over its energy.
Right.
So kilowatts versus kilowatt hours. So if you have a 100 kilowatt hour battery and you're charging it at 200 kilowatts, it's being charged at 2C.
Right. Yep.
So you want to have as high a C rate as possible for as fast a charge as possible, but that brings with it increased heat dissipation. And if you charge a battery too quickly, the individual cells, as they're charging, the cathode potential increases, but the anode potential decreases. The potential difference of the cell between the two gives you the cell voltage. So the voltage is the difference in potential between the positive and negative electrode. But as I say, as you are increasing the voltage of the cell, you are decreasing the potential of the anode versus lithium. And it will eventually reach a point where instead of lithium ions intercalating into the layers of graphene that make up graphite, pigeonholing their way in there safely for storage, they go, well, we're now at 0 volts versus lithium, I might as well just plate on top of this. But they don't plate evenly. They form these dendrites, these tree-like growths, which can puncture the separator, touch the cathode, and then you get a physical electrical internal short circuit.
Right,
and that's when you have thermal runaway.
Yeah.
So that's an issue that you have to combat against, and it's difficult to pick up exactly when that's happening, which is why until recently we've had fairly conservative rapid charging performance out of EVs, which has still been more than enough for the average dwell time at a UK motorway service station.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we can do better, and we're starting to see that now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that charge time is a thing we've talked about a lot in different contexts in this podcast and in other conversations as well, because there is a thing, and I know new EV adopters will be like, oh yeah, I want to find the 350 charger so I can charge at 350. And first of all, never seen that on my car ever, but also you don't need to, because when you work out your charging cycle, your kind of grazing, as lots of people refer to, you don't ever go from naught to, you don't ever get to the charge point at naught and try and get to 100 and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely I feel like we're probably in a reasonably good place in that, and the potential damage that you can do by, I guess, the faster you charge it, the greater potential of damage. In
theory, but that said, we're starting to see improvements not just in cell design, but in battery design that improve the C rate that can be achieved. So, for example, BYD have just released a lithium iron phosphate battery that can genuinely rapid charge in 5 minutes. And they've basically kind of nano engineered the structure of the cell. They'll have done various other tricks, but the thing that they're telling us publicly is that the path that those lithium ions can take between the negative and positive electrodes is so kind of arrow straight in comparison to the more kind of tortuous route that they would take in a more conventional lithium ion cell. So it just facilitates that incredibly fast C rate. And as a result, because it's capable of doing that, the internal resistance is lower, which means that the heat that's being generated for a given charge power is less. So, but that's one aspect of it, but also increased improvements in thermal management systems. This switch to liquid-based thermal management systems that happened quite early on, with the notable exception of the Nissan Leaf, which is an otherwise indefatigable car, but it has the worst design battery out there. It's so annoying because it can do all sorts of tricks, the Leaf. I mean, mine's powering my house just now back home, vehicle to grid. But Nissan, for the sake of a £500 liquid-based cooling system, hobbled their batteries in comparison to where they could have been. That said, though, just to throw in a kind of real-world counter-argument to all this, the fastest charge that you can do is the one that takes the least amount of your time. And in my case, I come home from work, I plug in my car, I set it to charge on off-peak electricity overnight, and then it's ready in the morning. That took seconds of my time. Yes, it took hours to charge, but the car is parked up for most of its life, 95% of its life anyway. And similarly, like we've done Edinburgh to Oban and back, and we obviously we were on holiday, we were doing kind of touristy stuff, stopping for 20 minutes, half an hour here and there. And the old school Tesla Model S we had at the time had a 22 kilowatt onboard charger, which is somewhat unheard of today, apart from old Renault Zoes. But that said, we're starting to see that come through from German OEMs. They like a 22 onboard charger. the point is that just by stopping 20, 30 minutes and plugging into these 3-phase AC charge points that are commonplace in rural areas, we didn't need to touch a rapid charger once. Seconds of our time didn't need to hang around waiting at a rapid charger.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think that's the thing. It's actually my dad who said this to me, where he said, I suppose when I'm about 3 years into my electric car journey, he was like, I suppose you never have to go to a petrol station. And I have one at the end, kind of not the end of my street, but the end of the road that attaches to my street. So I pretty much drive past it every day wherever I'm going. And I always think, that's obviously all the people queuing up to get petrol. I was like, no, never have to go to one of those. And you did think taking that amount of time, convenience away, but it does come back to the also a thing we've talked about a lot on this podcast before. The convenience of charging at home is fine if you have off-street parking and you have the facility for it is good. So there's definitely some interesting stuff there. And what is when we go back to thinking about some of the batteries? This is battery technology discussion we've kind of taken to today, to where we are. What's the kind of latest stuff, the new technology? I'll let you kind of answer. I'll ask it as an open question, but then I'm interested in some of the things that get talked about a lot, solid state batteries and those kind of things. Sure. But kind of where are we now, and what's our sort of near-term future from a battery technology point of view? What
I mentioned earlier about that great diversification is coming. And whilst most of it is still technically going to be lithium-ion, it's going to be an even broader church. And you'll take elements of some of the stuff I'm about to explain and kind of mix them and match them, almost like building, like a kid building with Lego and kind of using their imagination. You don't need to have this particular cathode with this particular anode and this particular electrolyte. So if you're clever enough, you can optimize that combination with these next generation technologies for your application. Okay. So you mentioned solid state. We'll start with that. That's been 5 to 10 years away for 5 to 10 years now, but there are... like autonomous cars and many other things in our industry. True. Yeah. I mean, for goodness sake, I did my PhD on lithium air. Look where that's got to, not. I mean, that's it, metal air batteries do exist. In fact, anyone who's got a hearing aid has a metal air battery, zinc air. It's a single-use thing, and as soon as you rip the wee tab off it, that's it, continuously discharging very slowly. So stick it in your ear as quick as you can. But anyway, in terms of a rechargeable lithium air cell, we're still a long way away from that. But we're starting to see the likes of iron air being used for large-scale grid storage. It's not very energy dense, but if you've got a large bit of land to stick a fairly inert battery onto, it's basically rusting and then unrusting and then re-rusting. That's the chemistry, It makes absolute sense, and it's cheap as chips. But and as I said on a previous podcast, it's made figurdos. So there you go. I just probably confused anyone with my Scottish accent there, but that's a reference to an Iron Brew advert. Anyway, so solid states, as I mentioned, there's some interesting developments there. So there's technically 4 kinds of solid state cell. And it depends on the electrolyte that's being used. So you've got either polymer-based, which is nice and flexible, which is what you want in a vehicle that's being shaken about, but it's not very ionically conductive. Lithium ions can't move through it very quickly. So your maximum charge speed is going to be somewhat hobbled. We've seen that because Bolloré had solid-state polymer batteries in Mercedes electric buses in the early 2020s. Okay. And in comparison to the conventional NMC lithium-ion liquid electrolyte cells that were also offered as standard in those buses, the range was increased modestly, but the charging time was considerably longer because they couldn't charge anywhere near as quickly as NMC conventional cells can. There's 2 other proper solid electrolytes. There's ceramics, which are quite conductive, so faster charging and so on, but they are brittle, not ideal for London's cobbled streets and some of the more quaint parts of town and so on. And then there's sulfides, which seem to be the holy grail in many aspects. They're very conductive. They seem to be a bit kind of easier to process. But lithium sulfide, there's no mature market for it. And on top of that, so there's a supply chain issue on that. And also lithium sulfide in contact with moisture, which wouldn't happen outside of a battery manufacturing facility unless you properly smashed up your car. You'd have other things to worry about if moisture was getting in touch with it. But for recyclers, it's going to be a faff because moisture plus lithium sulfide gives you toxic gases. Right, okay. H2S. So hydrogen sulfide even. So that's a concern. But it's something that's not insurmountable. We can handle materials responsibly. And then there's also semi-solid state, where you might have a solid state electrolyte, but then you're using liquid to wet one of the 2 electrodes to improve the kind of contact with the electrode and the solid electrolyte, which is quite difficult to achieve at the moment. Some manufacturers have gone about it in an interesting way. It's almost like little gel or liquid capsules contained within the solid electrolyte.
Right, okay.
So that's a neat way of doing it. And then I've got to give a shout out to a fairly local company based in London, Taisan, or Taisan. I should really remember how it's pronounced. Taisan. They are an incredible startup that have combined not just solid state, but it's actually quasi-solid state. So they're applying the electrolyte as a liquid and then polymerizing it in situ. Right. But what's particularly interesting is they're not using lithium. They're using sodium.
Oh, okay.
Sodium is incredibly abundant. It's incredibly cheap. I've described it before as being the Geordie of chemistries because it's not bothered about what the temperature is. It will go to the nightclub in the middle of winter and just have a t-shirt on. No need for a jacket. What does that mean in terms of EVs? It means you've got excellent cold weather performance. You're not losing as much range in colder temperatures. And although sodium is not as energy dense as lithium because it's a bigger, heavier atom for starters, Taisan have managed to get the energy density of their prototype cells pretty much up to where NMC is today, but at a much lower price point and a much more temperature resilient price point. Right. That's exciting.
So that's the improvement, because I think a lot of the talk originally was going, well, when we've got these new batteries, you'll be able to get 10 trillion miles range from one charge, and they're going to weigh this much, and they're going to cost 2p, and you go, okay, I'm not sure about that. And that sounds like that's like, well, if you apply all of the bits of chemistry in isolation together, in theory, on a bit of paper, maybe that works. But so it sounds like the opportunity is more about possibly cost, possibly some of the energy kind of density or heat aspects. So we're not going to necessarily see something with 500, 600, 700 mile range straight away, but maybe...
Well, it's coming. There are some interesting examples that are under real world tests right now. So Factorial Energy is one of many US-based startups that are particularly exciting for solid state. Arguably some of the most interesting developments are coming out of US startups. So you've got QuantumScape as well that's worth mentioning, and Solid Power. But Factorial, they've got two different versions of solid state cell, one of which is semi-solid state, so they've got the kind of liquid and solid, and one that's properly solid state. I'm pretty sure the one that Mercedes has in a modified EQS electric car on the road just now, doing testing, will be the semi-solid state version. Yep. And I think they're claiming a range of 600-ish miles per charge off of that. Right. With their fully fledged solid state version, all solid state, you could probably push that up to at least 800 miles, if not more. There's some exciting improvements to come. We just need to make sure that it's stable, that it scales, that it's repeatable, that it's affordable. BMW have said that they're not going to be using solid state cells in any of their EVs until at least 2033, not because it's not technically feasible, but because it's not financially feasible yet. Right. Production costs at scale is an issue.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like the potential is there for that, but it is some way off. And I think that's how when people mention it to me, but my response, having way less information about it than you have, although I have more now from this conversation, is thinking about it and going, okay, it's fine. Yes, I understand it's possible, but until you've got a manufacturer who is building them in a factory, even in like small scale, you can't then think, knowing what an OEM's manufacturing cycle is, unless you've got something that's rolling off a production line on one Mercedes model, it's not going to be across all the Mercedes models for 5+ years because just of the time that it takes. So, and it seems like we're a little way away from the start line in a sense. So you've got those few steps to make.
That said, it does depend on the manufacturer. So MG claims they're going to have a semi-solid state EV this year. They claim that it's not going to be overly expensive. I would expect there to be a modest increase in range, but it's not going to be the holy grail that all solid state, particularly ceramic or sulfide. That
will be the start line of the first race.
Absolutely.
In the solid state game, which is great that becomes today. But then for your 800 mile range for half the price of a current battery is the end of the last race sort of thing in the cycle. So definitely interesting. And I think when we've talked a bit about batteries again, but before on this podcast in this series, talking about the used car market, talking about the impact on. So we've been talking about some of the charging performance, and you mentioned about some of the damage that can happen with rapid charging and other things. And interesting hearing it from the scientific side, whereas we were talking about it more from that residual value side. But is that a thing that you kind of you're seeing, or you're getting involved in understanding a bit of how that's operating? I've heard about different companies who are now building batteries where they're less repairable because they're in kind of bigger cells and things like that. But what's your sort of take on that area of the market?
Yeah, I mean, it would be inexcusable if the automotive sector ended up a bit like the smartphone sector today, where a few short years ago you could take the back off of your smartphone and you could replace the battery. And if you buy a Fairphone today, Dutch startup that makes ethical modular phones, you can have the screen off in about 30 seconds if you know what you're doing. You can repair it really easily. I believe that the right to repair laws will prevent this from happening, but if we ever end up with an EV that's got a completely sealed battery pack that has to be chucked out with the car, then that's never going to happen. And in fact, I'll tell you why that won't happen. That's because the EU battery regulation that's come in, and of course, technically we're not in the EU just now, but we are very much, as a smaller right-hand drive market versus that massive block. Manufacturers are not going to design just around us; they're going to design around the larger kind of customer base. And one of the rules that's come in is that new cells from 2031 onwards need to have an increasing percentage of recycled content within them. So I think off the top of my head, we're talking 6% recycled lithium, 6% recycled nickel, 16% recycled cobalt. And those are sliding scales that increase throughout the 2030s. So it's important for automotive OEMs to be able to easily recover the battery and to recycle it. But we are starting to see an increasing move towards cell to pack, where instead of having bite-sized modules, you end up with basically every cell kind of linked together to form one big battery. I'm hearing rumors of clever ways of being able to take chunks out of that cell to pack design if required, but I would need to look at some of the latest developments that are once they come out to see if that's actually happened or not. However, recyclability is going to be increasingly important, and that is something that these big OEMs will pay attention to. So not too worried about that. The residual value side of things, the health of batteries as they age. People who aren't familiar with EVs, who haven't driven one before, haven't owned one before, long term, they will obviously be a bit worried about it because they'll see the lifespan of the battery in a smartphone or a laptop, and they'll think, oh, it's a lithium-ion battery, so it must be the same. It's really not. The chemistry that you find in a smartphone or a laptop is very different to that in an EV. The actual physical design of the cell, the structure of it is optimized more for live fast, die young than conservatively designed for a long lifespan. It will not be thermally managed properly. It won't have a liquid-cooled battery management system like an EV does. And also those cell voltages within a laptop or smartphone are pushed as high as they possibly can just for a couple of minutes worth of extra runtime. And that kills them in that process. Whereas an EV deliberately blocks off its top and bottom kind of few millivolts. And it's not a huge amount it's blocking off. So you're not losing a huge amount of range, but you're massively improving lifespan by reducing the rate at which decomposition or degradation reactions happen within the cell. But nonetheless, you still want to know what the health is of that battery. And at the moment, there's not a standardized way of doing that. Each manufacturer has its own state of health algorithm. State of health being the range of, or the capacity of the battery today versus when it was new in EV terms. So each automotive OEM has a different way of doing it. And what we really need is a kind of more universal approach so that you can compare like for like across different makes and models and compare on a level playing field. And there are some very interesting companies out there that are working on that just now. There's some quite impressive ones. I'll name Clearwatt as an example. They have a particularly pragmatic approach, which isn't just like an instantaneous look at what the cell voltages are. That tells you a little bit, but not a huge amount. Whereas they take like a proper look at the data as the car is being driven or charged, which gets my electrochemical seal of approval. You can get a lot more information from that. But that's going to help the sector no end.
And I think is that what we've talked about it a couple of times on the podcast. It's definitely a growing area of I was going to say concern, probably interest to the market, particularly to our listeners in kind of the leasing and rental space. You have large amounts of vehicles on your balance sheet, of which a growing percentage are EVs. But I think when you're a second-hand buyer, it seems to be the consensus where we've been discussing it is more about the transparency of it rather than the actual range. Like if you go, okay, well, I know if I'm comparing two cars, if I can understand the battery and it's priced accordingly, maybe I'll take the one that's got the most degradation, because if I'm only using it as my second car and it's going to the shops and back, I'll just have the cheaper one. It doesn't necessarily matter. But what you can't do, you can't take your dad to the used car lot anymore where he looks under the bonnet and goes, oh no, that's about to blow the head gasket, when he was clearly making it up, probably in my case. But that you haven't got that same visibility. So it's more the transparency rather than needing to, the batteries needing to be as new. It's just to understand what the situation is. Interested as well, you're talking a bit about the batteries themselves and their kind of repairability and changeability. There seems to be some different views on what happens to the battery at the end of life. So you're talking about the recycling. We're also seeing that actually the degradation over a long period of time on a battery in a car is not actually that bad. No, so they're lasting for a lot longer than maybe people were expecting, or certainly generally people were assuming maybe. Do you think that it's likely that batteries will be kind of like repaired to stay in life, or is it more likely the batteries are just going to come out and go into something where there's less of a need for energy dense storage and other bits? Well,
in terms of repairability, that's already happening. So there are UK companies that specialize in dropping out a battery pack, diagnosing the specific faults that a dealer might tell you that battery pack's had it, that needs to be replaced. Normally under an 8-year or 100,000 mile warranty at least. Some are more generous than that. I think Toyota goes up to a decade, for example. But, so first of all, unless you have a much, much older car, you don't need to worry about that. Yeah. But if you do have an older car, or if you've done stupidly high mileage, then you want to be able to repair rather than replace. And that's where your third-party EV specialists are more than capable of dropping out the battery pack and finding those faults. Sometimes it's like a PCB rather than the actual cells. Sometimes it's just one module. And what could have been potentially 5 figures in a worst-case scenario for some of the more awkward EVs becomes much more manageable, certainly 4 figures maximum, and low 4 figures at that. If I recall correctly, there's a company in Brighton called Cedar Electric, and they can do that with Tesla Model S battery packs, for example. They can repair them for about a third of a cost of a new battery from Tesla. Right. Okay. So, it's and it keeps that vehicle on the road and that battery on the road for a long time. But, once the state of health or the usable range reaches a point where it's no longer suitable, not just for, long distance driving on a regular basis, but for, as you said, your kind of shorter roundabout town sort of trips and so on. If it just becomes less marketable on the used vehicle market, then there are companies out there that will take used electric vehicle batteries and put them into static energy storage systems to give them a second life in those. A good example is Felton, based in, near Bristol. Their new Charge Cube, spelt with a Q, is a clever design.
Marketing, that is.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So the Charge Cube takes, in fact, this is something that I had been shouting from the rooftops for at least 3 years to anyone who would listen, and I'm glad that someone, I'm not going to take credit for it, they'll have independently conceived it, but I'm just glad that someone's doing it. Because the Tesla Model 3, unlike the Model S that has more kind of bite-sized modules and lots of them, the Model 3 has 4 basically giant fish finger modules that are at least a meter long and incredibly heavy and awkward to handle. And for second life use in electric classic car retrofitting, Model S modules are perfect for quite a lot of designs of older, smaller chassis. But try getting a Model 3 module into the back of a BMW Isetta bubble car. That's not happening. So there's less value, even though the cells are technically better. So what else can you do with them? Get a shipping container, stick them all in there. Nobody's buying these batteries because you can't use them for anything else. You've got yourself a bargain energy storage system, and that is what Felton has done, but with the clever engineering to back that up. The way they've designed that has been, brilliant from what I've seen so far. But the point is that, we're seeing those second life applications happening. But again, because of the EU battery regulation saying that we need a certain percentage of recycled content in new cells, we're now going to be up against automotive and cell manufacturers saying, see that old EV you've got that's still running around at 350,000 miles and the battery's at 70% state of health. You done with that? because they want to get the battery out of it so that they don't get fined for missing these quotas. And those quotas are going to increase throughout the 2030s. But batteries aren't dying as quickly as we thought they would. And there's this whole kind of vicious cycle. So what we might see as an unintended consequence of what's actually a very good piece of legislation that I fully support is that some older batteries might get pulled out of life earlier just to recover those materials to put into new batteries that will be even longer lasting, even better designed, even longer range, etc. Just because you've taken an older chemistry doesn't mean you need to keep that existing chemistry. You can break it down and rebuild it. Yeah,
because the raw material is, when you break it down to its raw material, it can be reapplied in any way. I just find that secondhand or repurpose and beyond, well, actually, I find the secondhand EV market super interesting with my kind of like leasing background. But then going one stage further about kind of reconditioning of EVs and the batteries, that is such a fascinating space. And I actually didn't realize about the EU regulation, which is another aspect on top. But this idea that you could take a car and basically keep a trigger's broom. Again, also apologizing to all listeners, I keep using the same analogy every episode. But this idea that you could change part, you go, okay, right, the motor's shot and the screen is out of date inside, right? Well, I'll just change those, and now it's basically as good as new. Okay, right. Well, the seats are a bit worn out. We'll reupholster the seat. Right, one of the cells is knackered. Well, we take that out, and put that into a battery storage unit and replace it with a reconditioned one that's come out of a car that was running. This idea that things become more modular is super fascinating to me. But then also potentially then you've got this thing where people will be going, oh, well, actually, no, just scrap it. It'll be fine. Because I was talking to some guys, and I won't get too much into it because I actually would like to get them on the podcast. It's one of my jobs for this week. But there's a couple of big global brands who have created a battery recycling center. And I was at an event where partly they were launching it, but they were doing some stuff, and it was asked for a Q&A. And I just went, how many, this huge facility, and I was like, how many batteries are you expecting to put through this? And they were sort of like, awkwardly, we're not sure. Because I'm like, I don't know that any batteries need recycling right now. I mean, in any kind of volume. It's the right solution to a problem that doesn't exist yet. And there's going to be a question about when and how that's going to come. And there's the speed of it,
We need those recycling facilities. But as you say, the supply is not there yet. And some startups are going to really struggle with this. What we're going to see as well is that older recycling techniques were not particularly efficient. There was maybe 40 to 60% material recovery from pyrometallurgical techniques. In other words, stick it in a furnace and melt it down. You would get the cobalt and the copper out of that because those are the two most expensive materials. But lithium, even aluminium and so on, would just end up in the slag. It would just be waste. So that was not very efficient. And also it was very energy intensive because it was like 800 odd degree furnaces and so on. Degree C. But now we've started to move on to to hydrometallurgical, I should say, which is using basically vats of acid to eat these batteries apart and to recover the raw materials that way. So not particularly energy intensive, but you're dealing with nasty acids. However, there have been some interesting processes that involve direct recycling, and the UK is one of the leaders on this. So the ReLib project, which involves the universities of Birmingham and Leicester, two of the cool things they've done in terms of recycling and kind of direct recycling and so on. One of them is that you take the electrodes out of a automotive pouch cell, like sheets out of a book, put it into an ultrasonic bath, which either has a very mild acid or no acid at all, and literally shuggle the electrode material off of the metal foil into which it's coated, and then you just skim that off. And for the sake of simplicity here, layperson's terms, you just sprinkle a bit of fairy dust on it and then slap it into a new cell, and it outperforms the original battery it came from when that battery was new. It's incredible what they can do. And the other one is this one's brilliant. So they took shredded cell material, like black mass, basically it's called, your shredded materials. And you had the negative electrode, the anode, mixed in with the cathode, which is a bit of a problem. You want to kind of separate that out. Now, in the heat of the moment, I can't remember which one was hydrophobic and which one was hydrophilic, but there was one of them did not like water and one of them absolutely loved it. So they put it into this container with water and then added some cooking oil and and kind of mixed it up. And I think it was the anode material, the graphite, that was attracted to the cooking oil. And then the cathode material just sunk to the bottom where the water was. So the reason I kind of giggled there is because when I read the journal article. I've never once seen a journal article that when it's listing all of the materials that were used for the experiment from like Sigma Aldrich or wherever, these kind of big scientific providers, it was like, rapeseed oil, Morrison's. And it's just, it's household staple stuff, that's being used to recycle batteries.
Yeah, fantastic.
It's totally doable.
Yeah. So I mean, such a fascinating space. So yeah, can't wait to find out more of how that's going, and it's kind of following it through its path. One of the things we kind of touched on it a little bit about the energy storage stuff, and I know we're in a largely automotive podcast, but I wanted to ask you a bit. I know you've been working on a few kind of larger scale grid storage projects, and personally fascinated in it, because I just think the idea of how we're going to balance the grid, how I'm also going to ask you about vehicle to grid in a minute, as you mentioned it as well, but this idea of, because that's also was one of the big, we'll never be able to, the grid won't be able to cope with electric cars, which is total nonsense. But I'm fascinated just about that, what kind of thing you're working on, and how how that's going to kind of come to fruition.
Well, there's been a lot of technical due diligence with the consultancy recently, and we're definitely starting to see a significant boost in grid storage projects. But again, we're seeing an even greater diversification in grid storage projects than we've seen even in the automotive sector in terms of the technology that's being used. Because not only have we moved towards lithium iron phosphate batteries for grid storage because it's so cheap, it's so comparatively safe. We'll come back to that in a second, but we're starting to see non-battery energy storage technologies being deployed that are absolutely fascinating. And I would say that two of the most interesting ones both literally they get their storage medium out of thin air. So one of them is the bizarrely named Cheesecake Energy. Right. And what they have is containerized, a bit like LFP shipping container grid storage systems that we've seen photos of before. But instead of that, you've now got in that shipping container compressed air being stored in there, but they're using old retired heavy goods vehicle diesel engines to act as generators. So they will never see a drop of fuel again. Yeah. But diesel is compression combustion. So you can it's proper scrap heap challenge stuff. They take these old diesel engines and then use an electric generator, obviously powered with excess renewables and so on, to compress air, which then gets fed into the storage tank, and then the opposite happens when you need the electricity back. You expand it through the engine, and that drives the generator. So that's an incredible use of what's going to be an increasing stockpile of redundant components, But the other one, which really scales, because that's on the kind of hundreds of kilowatt hours per container scale, if I remember rightly, or per installation. Kind of more community.
You would get some challenges at scale there if you wanted to have one or a couple of those in, like you say, in a rural community or something. I guess it can work, but maybe at a bigger scale, more challenging.
Well, I think for a rural community, it would be the right kind of size for it. Yeah. But perfect. When you're looking at like actually balancing the entire grid rather than just kind of local backup and so on, there's an incredible company called Highview Power. And Highview Power has developed a cryogenic air storage system. So again, it's all kind of gas/cryogenic, handling equipment. It's just big metal vats. We've had those for donkey's years. They're available off the shelf. And you're using excess renewable energy to cryogenically freeze air, and then that air is heated up and then run through turbines when you need electricity again, and it's sent back to the grid. If you are not using any waste heat or cold streams from nearby industrial processes, the efficiency is about 60%. But you can get that up to about 70% if you can utilize waste heat or cold streams to heat the air and chill it when required. And it's also very good at keeping its own excess heat and cold from the various stages of its own operation. But it is designed for scale. We're seeing, I think there's at least 4 being deployed in the UK just now. One in Scotland next to Hunterston Nuclear Power Station, which is going to be 2.5 gigawatt hours, if I remember rightly. That's going to be enough to power, near as damn it, a quarter of Scotland's homes for 12 hours.
Wow. Okay, yeah.
Well, 25% of Scotland's homes, 1 unit. It's a big unit, but it's still, you'd have these all over the country. And unlike pumped hydro, where you need to find the ideal mountain to hollow out, like to Norway and so on, pumped hydro is great, but there's only it's geographically constrained. This is not. You could build it somewhere flat, like Peterborough or what have you, and it would work perfectly fine. So that's the exciting bit. And the other important thing to point out here with regards to efficiency, because we want to be as efficient, pragmatically efficient as possible with every last electron of renewable energy that we have. That high view power system is perfect for long-term energy storage. And it absolutely kicks the stuffing out of hydrogen. Hydrogen storage, for every 3 electrons of renewable energy you would put into it, you'd only get 1 back. It would throw the other 2 away. It's grossly inefficient. It obviously has the flammability hazards and so on, which, it's easy enough for me to take pot shots because, battery industry, we get enough pot shots like that. But point is, air doesn't tend to catch fire. So, it's literally out of thin air. It's a far more efficient setup. And I think it's far more likely to get planning permission as well. So that is exciting for large scale energy storage.
Yeah, interesting. And then on the, coming back to more local, also thing I'm fascinated about is vehicle to grid. So kind of asking on kind of personal level of, I'm thinking of getting solar and how's it working, but also future father-in-law is obsessed with it now with his 26 solar panels on his roof that he's got, and how spends all his time looking at his app where all the energy's going, but has an electric car, but at the minute can't do vehicle to grid. So how do you see that progressing? First of all, how what's your setup at home? What's the breakdown?
So I've got the only setup that you could possibly get your hands on now, for now, but you annoyingly can't even get your hands on that. So I'm lucky enough to have an Indra vehicle to grid charger. And when I upgraded from my Leaf to my Tesla, I very conspicuously held on to that Leaf at the back of the driveway, because I knew that if I was lucky enough to get onto one of the trials with Indra, because you can't buy these, they're only available for trials, I would be able to use my Leaf to power my house. And that's exactly what happens. So it'll be charging up off of the solar panels just now. It'll run the house in the evening and then overnight as well. I am saving silly money on my electricity bills because during summer, I've basically got free electricity for everything because of the solar panels. And then during winter, because I'm on Octopus Go, instead of paying whatever the peak rate is, like 25, 26 pence a unit, I'm paying nearer 8. So, and that's for 24/7 running of the house. That's the heat pump, the hot water, everything. So that's what everyone else will eventually be able to expect, but with a couple of key differences. One, CHAdeMO has lost the format war, despite it's Betamax. It was the superior technology to VHS or CCS in this case. I won't get into that rant. There's other podcasts where I've ranted about it. CCS is anyway. CHAdeMO is vastly superior, but has lost the format war because of, I don't know, bureaucracy. But point is that it just works, and it had V2G capability from day one. CCS did not. However, CCS now does have vehicle to grid capability, but we're still waiting on the chargers becoming available en masse. We do have some CCS vehicle to grid, vehicles actually doing vehicle to grid in the UK today, but there are things like bin lorries. Large bi-directional chargers. And speaking of large, my vehicle to grid charger at home, and this will be the same for CCS because they're both DC formats. So instead of the charger being in the car, the AC, like AC, for example, your AC Type 2 charge point feeds AC electricity into the car. The onboard charger in the car converts that to DC, runs it into the battery. With a rapid charger or DC charging format, it's the charger itself that's converting or rectifying AC to DC, which then feeds it straight into the battery. So whilst I've got an AC charge point that's about the size of a shoebox, my Indra unit, which is actually slightly less powerful, 6 kilowatts instead of 7 kilowatts, arrived on a pallet. It's a massive, big, heavy thing. And that's what it's going to be for DC vehicle to grid for anyone, even when it becomes CCS format for like a domestic setup. That said, silicon carbide electronics might help to reduce the size eventually, but it's going to be pricey as well. The price will be 4 figures for the unit rather than 3 figures. Just because there's more guts to it. To finish this monologue and let you get a word in.
No, but I'm making notes. I'll be reporting back to the boss when I get straight after this. So.
Nice one. I've just realised there is actually a glimmer of hope for anyone wanting vehicle to grid, and that is Renault. So the Renault 5 can do vehicle to grid via AC. So once again, Renault just had to be different, and they decided to use an AC format when everyone else was using DC to do it. Case point, Renault Zoe, it's like, well, CHAdeMO exists. We'll just make a massive onboard charger and use Type 2, which is a destination charging format, to rapid charge. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that didn't work, but that's the only reason why triple-headed rapid chargers have an AC cable on them just for Zoes.
Right.
Basically, it's so stupid. Anyway, the point is that Renault's done it again. They've gone down the AC route. This time it's less barmy. Your AC bidirectional chargers are not that much more expensive. I've heard rumours they might even be more efficient because of the kind of the switching gear, if you wish, the electronics that are used in them. But so that's good. It means that your car is going to be an even more efficient vehicle to run. But they've made life harder for themselves because the car is the vehicle to grid charger, not the off-board DC charger, because it's an AC wall box it'd be using. And that means that for every market that Renault sells the Renault 5 into, if they want that car to be able to do vehicle to grid, they need to certify it with that local grid.
Right.
Whereas other OEMs like Volkswagen, I know they've said that the ID4 is capable of doing vehicle to grid, for example, but they're probably going, I can't say for sure, but they're most likely going, well, we're not certifying that. We'll let the charger manufacturers figure that one out.
Let the chargers do it country by country, or the countries they operate in, and tie-ups with people like Octopus, I guess, and those kind of things as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, that's good. Some good stuff to report back to future father-in-law on that. I just want to cover off as well, because I'm conscious that, and again, this is such a fascinating topic for me that I could do another hour, but I'm conscious of the time. I want to touch on, I spent a little bit of time on ChargeSaint. So spending a lot of your time obviously doing your consultancy stuff, but also have your own startup, which I applaud anybody on here with their own startup having been 7 years into mine, which is no longer starting up. It's a thing. It's somewhat challenging. But tell us a little bit about it. I was going to try and give an overview of it, but it's better for you to explain it. But yes, it's a super valuable tool in the market. So give us the overview of that.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to have a nice bit of feedback from a happy customer. There we go. But I say customer, user. It will always be free for you to use. Yeah. But for those of you who don't know, so ChargeSaint is an app that allows EV drivers to report blocked or broken charge points directly to the owner of those charge points, so that they can take action to fix faults quicker and to stop bay blocking incidents from happening again. And as you said, we are a startup. We've been lucky. We've had a couple of Innovate UK projects and Department for Transport, TRIG, Transport Research and Innovation Grant. That project allowed us to launch ChargeSaint, the app, on Apple and Android. And we even won an award from that, from the Chief Scientific Advisor project with the best growth potential. Right. And funnily enough, so users are EV drivers, everyday EV drivers. If you come across an issue, then you can submit a report within a matter of seconds, like sub 60 seconds basically. It gives you very clear instructions on the photographic evidence to take of the issue, whether it's a broken charge point or a vehicle that's parked there that shouldn't be. So that then gets sent to us. We run a trust score, AI enhanced trust score on it, so that we can verify, this report is legitimate. We've got enough evidence here, and we can then forward that on to our customers, who would be and are charge point operators, car park operators, automotive OEMs, anyone who deals with charging infrastructure, basically. And we're very lucky at the moment. We have a partnership with Chargy, one of the biggest on-street charging networks in the UK. That project's going really well. They've started shouting about us through their social media channels, but also if you go onto the Chargy app and you go onto their map, pick a charge point that you've tried to charge at, there's now a button on there that says, is this bay blocked? Report it with ChargeSaint. It takes you through to us.
Fantastic. Yeah, great.
So, their head of driver support is actively looking through your reports that you've been sending to us on ChargeSaint, and thank you for that. We do appreciate that. Been looking through their Chargy reports, I should say. We're not spamming them with what like Grid serves up to, but some of you have reported other CPOs, charge point operators issues as well. So that's handy. There are others lining up as we speak to become customers. But fundamentally, as an EV driver, that app will always be free to use because it's a functional tool to keep the network running and to try and make public charging as smooth and as hassle-free an experience as possible, because that all started for two reasons. One, I've been driving EVs since 2009, and I've seen various parts of the country and various types of location of charge points and so on, where some people feel that they can just park there even if the signage is abundantly clear, and some where the signage is not abundantly clear and people park there, and then it stops you from charging, and it's incredibly frustrating, and it's that feeling of powerlessness because who can I report this to? Who will do something about it? That's what we are working hard to chase up.
Yeah.
And it's, we're getting through. We're making people aware of this, and they're starting to sit up and take notice. Sometimes even the CPO's own data, charge point operators, acronym alert, charge point operators' own data, they've not necessarily picked up on some absolute whoppers. Like there was one of a van that had remained plugged in to the same charge point, locked into it for 5 days straight.
Right.
Like, there's no way that it had a however many megawatt hour battery. That would be
maybe it had the whole back was filled with
exactly. It was selfish, but there was no official rule there that you couldn't do that, and that's hopefully something that's going to be under review.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing. Is again, it was also as an EV driver, there's bits where it's just there's an ICE vehicle blocking a bay, which is kind of our ultimate frustration. And thankfully for me personally, I've not had a situation where I haven't been able to access a charger because they were all full and one was blocked, but I've witnessed that at a point where I didn't want to charge. So I mentioned at the start, when I was in a car park, shopping centre, a supermarket car park this weekend, they've just put some, I think they're either Instavolt or Osprey chargers in there, brand new ones. But it's a really, really busy car park in the centre of a kind of town. And there was like 4 ICE vehicles in there. There's someone they've driven around and gone, the car park's full. I'm just going to park in these. And because the bays, I guess, had relatively low utilization because they knew people are maybe getting used to them being there. And I was thinking, right, if I needed to charge now, I would be absolutely furious. But there are bits where people, electric drivers, are bay blocking, and that's a bit. It's as problematic, but slightly more difficult to manage in the usage. But it's definitely an interesting challenge.
It's infuriating when EV drivers betray their brethren by blocking a charge point that they may well need someday. What if the tables were turned? In fact, and it's amazing what people have been reporting with charge saying. It's beyond what we'd expected.
Right.
And a prime example of this is the lengths that some people will go to avoid a parking fine.
Right.
But our app covers that off straight away because the evidence we've got is very much, we've just exposed what you've just tried to do there. So someone took a photograph of an EV that had been plugged into an on-street charge point, which, as I say, it had been properly physically plugged in, but they'd not even attempted to activate the charging session. So a traffic warden wandering past is going to go, well, that's plugged in, that's fine. But they then showed another photo where they'd just been able to pull out the cable, which that would not have been able to do if the charging session had been activated. Even if it had completed, it would still have remained locked in. So there was no attempt to actually charge. They just wanted to avail of the parking bay. And that's something that wouldn't have been possible to, with the naked eye for a traffic warden, but we would be able to give them more than enough information to go, go and check that one. They're having you on. And then actually, just another quick anecdote, which I found quite amusing when we were doing some sleuthing on this. Someone sent a photograph of an EV which was blocking, of a petrol car that was blocking a charging bay. Doesn't matter where the location was, but I went on to Google Street View at the location that was taken from. And it would have been the summer of last year. And this was like a month ago. So, summer of last year, perfect view of the car park, perfect view of the charge point, and the exact same bay being blocked by the exact same car. They've clearly just claimed it as their personal spot, and we are coming for you.
Excellent. So, well, as a way to finish up, doing good for the EV drivers out there, as the name suggests, the saviour of the bay blockers, which is going to be become more of a thing, I'm sure, over time. Euan, thanks so much for coming on. Super fascinating. I really enjoyed getting into some of the detail. I always say to our guests before that this is the podcast to get a little bit geeky about all things auto. So thank you for getting under the skin of that, and I know our listeners are going to really enjoyed it. Thank you to everybody for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please look to subscribe across our podcast channels. So we're in all of the usual places. Video is also on YouTube, so you can subscribe there as well. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.